All right. Thank you all for coming. This talk is delivering Agile Methodologies and Emerging Technologies in Hostile Environments. I'm Martin Snyder. I'm the CTO of Wingspan Technology. Wingspan builds document management solutions for regulated industries. So we've operated in this space for about 20 years. And what everyone wants to know is what does a hostile environment mean to me? And I'm thinking of a hostile environment in the same terms as the South Pole. It's something, there's a lot of hazards there. In this case, it's specifically hostile to the things that we want to achieve. It's hostile to Agile methodologies. It's hostile to emerging technologies. But what's important is that it's not hostile out of intent. There's no malice. It just is. The nature of these things is to be hostile to what we want to achieve. And if we can understand that nature, if we can understand how it is that they've come to be hostile, then we can build approaches that can let us at least do some of the things we want to do while still operating in those environments. So what do we want? We want modern practice adoption. We want to have better efficiency. We want to have better value delivery. It's not that we want to do Agile. We want the things that Agile gives us. With emerging technologies, we want to take advantage of these because they have more efficient solutions to today's problems. There's also some elements with like modern ecosystems. If you're forced to use, say, a legacy library, you could be in a situation where it supports HTTPS, but it only does it with SSL. It can't do TLS. And this can, for instance, just completely blow up in terms of your compliance or security practices or things like that. So there's a lot of advantages of being on the front end of the curve, and then there's some advantages where you want to be like up on that leading edge. So how are these environments hostile? Again, this is the title of this slide is important. Like saying how instead of why. Why is a bad word to use when you're asking questions of this nature because why implies intent, and that's something we want to get away from. It's what is it that makes these things hostile? And the first thing is there's rigid processes in a lot of these environments, and it's easy to see because rigid is an antonym for Agile, right? So of course that would be hostile to what we're trying to achieve. There's a lot of implied requirements. This ends up being the biggest category. There's things that that not everyone, especially when you get all the way down to the lowest level project teams, that people aren't necessarily aware of, that have heavily influenced why they do what they do. And then you have the status quo. Just we're doing it this way because we've always done it this way, and that can be very challenging to combat. And all of these things kind of conspire along with a few other things to build these environments. And it's helpful to look at an example. So Google has this great feature where if you search for an electronics product like one of these two flagship phones, it'll just tell you kind of the common specs and what it costs and everything. And so we have a little table here. We have the top Android phone, the iPhone, and we can see they have measurables, right? We can compare them and we can say which one is better. If I need more storage than the stock Android, the most common configuration has more storage. The 6S Plus has the bigger screen, battery life is comparable, and we could fill this entire time slot talking about how this is an unfair characterization, and we can talk about the metrics, and we can really get into it, and we can try to decide which one is better. But ultimately, they're so similar, it doesn't really make much of a difference. So I found a third phone that we're going to throw into the mix. And it was hard to actually research the exact specs because when they talk about the Iridium Extreme, they say things like, well, yeah, it has a 100 element address book, which sounds pretty handy. I'm not sure how many gigabytes of storage that correlates with. And then the display, I'm pretty sure that I could take the dimensions of the phone and measure the display and get the diagonal, but it shows at least 200 characters at a time, so that's nice. And the battery life is way lower. And not only that, but this gets into what the metrics mean, because that battery life, that's for talk time. These are battery lives for like what they call heavy internet usage. If we were to do talk time on the smartphones, it's significantly higher. And then we have this percentage coverage, right? So we got 7% versus 100%, and that sounds really good. And think, well, so what's that? And what I think probably maybe a quarter of the people have probably already figured it out for certain, but 7% is the landmass of North America and Europe compared to the size of the globe. And I think that's pretty fair. Like when you take these phones, if you have the right carrier and the right SIM card and stuff, then you can use it on that's probably the greatest single area you can use a single phone on. And the Iridium, of course, they have pole-to-pole coverage. I mean, this is the satellite phone to end all satellite phones. Even within satellite phones, having the pole-to-pole ends up being tricky, and I think people that have a scientific bent can probably see how you might need 1 or 2 extra satellites to get that extra 10 or 20%. So now, we're going to work on a project together, and I've chosen the second base camp of Everest for its location, and now we're going to vote on who wants which phone. So if you like the Galaxy, raise your hand, please. I expected a couple people to vote for, at least just cynically. And the iPhone, people that, come on, you can't live without. Okay, we have one there. And then who wants to take the Iridium with you? So, great. So we've tallied the numbers. We've inflated the scores, and we've voted the Iridium. But what you just did, every single person that participated, thank you, and the people that didn't but wanted to raise their hand, you just chose waterfall methodology. That's exactly what you did. Right? You said, oh, well, I live in a world where there's this one requirement, or there's this small set of requirements that dominates everything else. It doesn't matter, right? Because in this case, it doesn't matter. All the other features of the phone don't matter because it simply doesn't work, at 20,000 feet on the border of Nepal. And so that's what we have to understand, is that like the hostility for waterfall versus Agile in particular, it doesn't come because people love waterfall and hate Agile. It's because they're rational actors. They're rational actors, and they've made the best choice. And it ended up being waterfall, okay? That's the world that we're in. And so what can we do? So let's look at it. Let's look at the origins of waterfall. Now, one thing I'd like to point out is that I carefully I found this picture of a waterfall that has the exact same number of steps as my mini waterfall diagram. So I just like everyone to appreciate that little attention to detail. So I have a couple scenarios I'm just going to play through for people. Hopefully some of these are familiar, or you can at least extrapolate to something that's familiar. So here we have Big Co, right? Some of us probably work for Big Co, or Big Co is a primary client, for instance. And Big Co has outsourced one or more functions, like software testing, or business analysis, or project management, or something. And so they've signed a multi-year contract with some vendor to provide staffing for that function. And part of that is an obligation to only use that vendor for that function, right? It's just part of the contract negotiations. And there might be special rules involved in this, like, for testing, like the smallest test team can be, 3 people plus a lead, or whatever it is. I mean, you don't really know what these rules are, but they exist. And so now you're on a software project, and you're in that environment, and you're obligated to use those resources in the manner specified. And so you have to build your entire project around that. Like, for instance, we can allocate these resources with 2.5 months notice, and you say how long you need them, and you give a start date or something. Well, now you know that you can't start your formal testing process until you give the word 2.5 months out. And then once you've done that, now you're kind of locked in. And those guys are going to drop everything else, and they're going to be waiting, and you better be ready on that date. There's regulatory scenarios. So we have a 3-letter agency, but pick your favorite. For me, personally, it's the FDA, so this kind of matches up a lot with what the FDA says, but it's, I think it's pretty similar in a lot of them. They say, and they're always very clear, like the first words in a lot of the guidance is, we're not going to tell you how to develop software. You can develop software any way you like. Who here has heard those words before in a hostile environment? And then they go on to say, okay, well, you can do that so long as all of your primary actions have dated evidence, right? We have to make sure that we're following the process correctly. And the only way that you know the evidence, you have to sign this or provide this or log that, and you have to put the date. And then you also have to meet these logical criteria. It's like, well, how can you possibly have tested this if it wasn't fully developed, right? How could you have developed it if it wasn't fully designed? And how could you have designed it if you didn't have the requirements done? And so it's, it basically all boils down to you can do it any way you like, so long as you do exactly waterfall. And then you can get business scenarios. So in this case, we've named the business. Who's ever heard of the business? In this case, we're going to imagine this application, and it's a document management application. Who would imagine I would come up with that? We're in the insurance industry, so there's claim forms coming in, there's people taking pictures of an accident with their phone and sending it in, so it's a lot of unstructured data. There's faxes, there's emails, there's all this stuff coming in, and we have a pool of people, and they're just kind of indexing it into a system. This is so successful, the pilot was so successful, we're going to triple the staff. Okay, and that's someone's job. Someone has to go out and they have to find, managers and people. And you want to start on this date. We're going to start at the start of the quarter, right? So October 1st is the go live date to put 500 new users in the system. And they're going to do all this work around that. And you have to train those people. We're going to have new features that can handle, some of the, because these new 500 users, they're going to probably, a lot of transient workforce potentially. Like we got to make the system a little simpler. So we have a whole bunch of new features. We're going to redesign the UI. We're going to bring all these people on. We got to train the people that are the existing users. We got to train those people. And so you have this huge concert of things going on. And it's all dependent on the software being done on Friday, September 29th, so that you can go live on the following Monday. So what are you supposed to do? Like, how do you project plan for something like that? And the answer is, well, you work backwards from the date. You build Gantt charts, and you just kind of stack up all the dependencies. And so the recurring themes here, the schedule is a dominant factor. Okay? There's one or more elements that you start at the calendar and you have to point to a square on the calendar, and then you're committing, and you're not committing in terms of like software delivery, you're committing as part of program delivery. A lot of this gets into the focus on interdependencies, right? These things are structured like relay races, right? There's going to be someone waiting for the baton at that moment, and you need to make a commitment to go and do that. So let's just shift for a second, because I feel, aside from the name of the conference, I think that using emerging technologies and using modern methodologies are related. They have some things in common. So let's just take a quick look at some of the things that lead to technology stasis, and then we'll shift gears and see what we can do to address all this. So we're back to Big Co. And in this case, Big Co, so they prefer large technology platforms because they're not in the business of operating software, but they still have to do it. And it's easier for them if they can use something where the cost profile is understood. And so an example of that is like, I want to hire some executive to come in and he's going to build me a database in J2EE infrastructure. And he can say things like, okay, well, that's going to cost us $2.3 million to set up and $800,000 a year to operate. And he can be right. And he can be within like a 3% tolerance. And why can he be right? He can be right because when you use super popular technologies like that, then the costs are known, but more importantly, you have this cost certainty, right? And not just financial costs. Like you can say, okay, well, a WebLogic admin will cost me, exactly this salary. But you can also say how long it will take to fill that position. Like I can fill that position in 4 weeks, and the person will probably be right within a day or two. And part of the reason for that is that when you focus on individual technologies, especially popular ones, everything gets easier. Right, like resume screening, keyword matching, like all the things that I think people at a conference like this are disinclined to like. Those things are effective in the right environment. And then you can outsource more functions. I can say to someone, oh, I would like you to hire me the operational staff. And again, with certainty, they can say, yes, we can commit to that by this date and with these costs. One of the other things is that you don't have to justify these things, right? So when you're looking at like a project team, it's easier, your costs as a project team are easier to adopt these known technologies because you don't have to explain it to anyone, especially someone that isn't technically savvy. So here's another one, and this makes perfect sense. We're talking about rational actors. So now I have this big infrastructure, right? I have a shared Oracle database, and that cost me, let's say it cost me $1 million a year to run my big shared Oracle database, and I have 10 applications using it. And I want to make sure that businesses pay for their share of this this infrastructure. So what do you do? Well, there's two ways, right? You can say, well, you guys, your 10 applications, you should pay $100,000 each, or I could maybe have some metric like table size or something and prorate it based on that. But I'm just going to share it across the people, either based on usage or just based on the fact that they're doing it. And so now you think of the reverse. It's like, okay, well I would rather use Postgres instead of Oracle. But I have to stand up that infrastructure, and I'm going to pay 100% of that ride. So even if it was less expensive, right? Like let's say it's 50% less to run a Postgres infrastructure. I'm going to pay 100% of that cost versus 10% of Oracle. So if I'm running that project, I have clear financial incentives, not just to not use emerging technologies, but to use exactly what everyone else is using, right? This is hostile to the use of emerging technologies. One of the big recurring themes here is about cost, but it isn't just dollars and cents. It's the cost related to operation, right? It's a long tail on these things because a lot of these systems Your development period might be 6 months or 18 months or a long development period of 3 years. But operationally, some of these things, they could run 10, 15, 20 years. Or the intent could be to run 10, 15, 20 years, and you could still be running 40 years later. I mean, that happened with Sabre, right? I mean, that was intended to be replaced at many different points. It's still used for airline reservations. And then the other thing is that your per project costs are heavily influenced by what's going on across the enterprise. And what it gets down to is that all these practices, they're all focused on macro level efficiency, right? They're trying to optimize costs across the entire organization. And if you're on a single project and you're trying to do the best things for that project, that you have to serve two masters, right? It's very hard for you to do the most effective things that you would want to do because you don't bear those long-term organizational responsibilities. And if you were the CEO or the CIO or something like that for one of these organizations, you probably wouldn't want to run multiple database infrastructures, even if one of them was better suited for single applications. So we want to deliver better methodologies, and they almost always reduce to the same thing. Is we want to iterate more, and we want those iterations to be faster. When we're going to do that, you gotta take the step back. You take the deep breath, right, and you say the serenity prayer. And if you're an atheist, you chop off God. You can still say the whole thing. The intent here is very clear. And what you start with is you internalize your definition of Agile. I think a lot of people either have a favorite definition or they have one of their own. For me, what I always start with is that Agile is not a software development methodology. Agile is a cultural approach to the development of software projects. Okay? And you can't change the culture. We were just talking about that. Like, the rational actors have built this culture which is hostile to that. So you're not going to take a book off the shelf and implement that, and you're not going to convince people that you're right and they're wrong. You have to realize that some of the things in these environments aren't going to change, or if they are going to change, they're not going to change before your project's over. So you have to have a tactical approach. Like, I know that when we talk about Agile, again, especially at conferences like this, the message is the exact opposite. But for this talk and this talk only, we're conceding the fact that we can't win that one. And so we're talking about what's left. And what's left, the only thing that matters is the feedback loop, right? This is what you spend all your time on. You need to build an improved feedback loop. And so that starts with a cross-functional team. But you don't ask for a cross-functional team and then get it, right? You don't go to the PM and suggest that this would be, right? If this is interesting to you, you go out and you recruit the cross-functional team. And the first thing that occurs to people is, well, that's inconvenient because they won't be allocated to the project, right? They won't be attached to it. They're going to have other duties. Now, this may be different for other people, but when I've sat at a kickoff meeting for even like a medium-sized software application or integration project or something like that, and people go around the table and they introduce themselves, the first person, they'll say their name and their title, and then they'll explain that they're not attached to the project, but they're here because they're probably the best expert, and maybe they'll get involved later when you reach a later cycle. And then the second person goes on to repeat the exact same disclaimer, and probably 75% of the people at the table aren't officially attached to the project. So I think that people are used to this. And why do they sit there? They sit there for two reasons. One is they have some feeling of obligation. Like, they know that probably they're the best person, or at least they're better than the alternatives to provide some level of guidance. And the other is they're afraid of what's going to happen if they're not involved, right? And so you have to sell them on being a part of your cross-functional team. And that's it. I mean, you go back to what are the benefits of these methodologies, and you sell them on those direct things. You're going to have a bigger impact on the finished product. You're going to, things will be better suited for what you're looking for. You're going to know what's coming. You're not going to be surprised. Like, one of the big problems you get in these waterfall methodologies is you get to UAT, right? And the people that asked for it and paid for it, they get to look at it, and they look at it, and there's always be at least one person that's disappointed, right? This isn't, I don't feel this is what I asked for, right? And I'd like to see these additional things. And the conversation usually goes like, well, that's fascinating. We're launching in like 21 days from now, and that's not going to change. And we don't have time to do another QA cycle, so the software isn't going to change. So we can log all these things as suggestions for the next version, but because the budget's going to change and the team, who knows, right? It's not really going to be up to us whether you get this or not. So this is the horror story you want to use to scare people into being on your cross-functional team, is to prevent that from happening. But it begs the question, right? It's like, well, why do companies do that? Right? Why do they put UAT at the end when it's almost too late to really go and get to the stuff that the users are best suited to talk about? And the reason is that if you do UAT earlier, the opposite happens. As they look at it, and you're like, okay, look at this screen. We have this design question, right? Because it looks like the flow is kind of off. And what they look at it, they say, well, I don't like the green here, and these buttons should be reversed, it's like the layout, these things are off. And it's like, no, I don't want you to look at that. I want you to talk about this. And they're not skilled in the art of developing software. They're not experienced in those things, and they start talking about the wrong things. And then they leave the office and they say, this project is off the rails. I just saw it, and it's terrible. They start bad-mouthing it. You can't trust them. There are certain people you can't trust to show them that pre-release software. Okay? This is a key word. You're going to build your own cross-functional team of people you trust. And you want people who have obligations in as many different segments of the waterfall as possible. And you want to sell them on these benefits directly, and you want them to want to be a part of the team. And you want the whole thing, this is not, like, all of these things are not so that software developers have an easier time of it. These things are all so that you have bi-directional feedback, so that you have greater participation, so that everyone's job is easier. Now, one of the things you want to be careful of when you're building your improved feedback loop and you are you're kind of competing with waterfall methodologies, which are going on at the same time, is you don't necessarily, you have to be very cautious that you don't pollute the process. Okay? There's a reason why software projects don't have the engineers write the requirements. Right? There's a reason. It doesn't really matter what it is. I think a lot of people know what the reason is. And there's a reason why they don't have the software engineers write the test case, or there's a reason why the test cases are written to the requirements and not to the product itself. And it's because while you do want to share information, you also want to have a certain independence. You want the finished product to have influences from analysis and software and testing. You want all of these things to contribute to the finished product. So you want to do this in such a way that it's you're sharing, right? You're sharing information, and you're creating a situation where it isn't, we're just building this and you got to write requirements to my screen. Like that's not going to work for several different reasons. Now, how you're going to communicate? You're going to communicate primarily through a continuous integration server. And this can cause issues in a lot of these organizations as well for two reasons. One is if you have to ask for something, you're not going to get it in time. But the second is if you don't ask for something, then that can cause problems too, because everyone hears these stories of, oh, gee, this person, they were running this like little web server, right, on their desk, and it was through like a slow hub and this and that, and then the power went out and the thing got destroyed. And this ended up being like a critical part of our infrastructure. And no one knew, and so we didn't have the right governance around it. And so that's why we don't want to let people go and do things on their own, right? And I'm, of course, advocating, hey, what you should do is you should do something on your own. And so what you want is, if you can do something the right way, do it the right way. I would never suggest otherwise. But your continuous integration server, I mean, this is a mindset, right? So if you, for instance, have an extra developer laptop, which is a good idea to have anyway, because if something happens to someone's laptop, you don't want them to lose a day or two configuring a whole new machine, right? So you have one extra machine where you can actually build the software on and you can run it. And it doesn't have to be on all the time. People can come to your desk and they can look over your shoulder. And that counts in my mind as a continuous integration server, as long as people can see work in progress and you can communicate through, through the software that is built at that moment. So what a lot of people go and try to do is they say, okay, well, look, we're stuck in this waterfall world, but we want to be agile. So what we're going to do is we're going to waterfall faster. Right? We're going to iterate over these 4 steps. We're not actually going to deploy it to the production servers. We're not going to give it to the users. And we can do this, and we can call this a sprint, and we can kind of squint really hard and try not to cry. But it doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is because you're not changing the culture. Like, you're ceding too much to the process. You're involving like all these things, and you're still handing everything off. Right? It's not a collaborative effort. It's exactly, it's tempting, and if it's the best you can do, I guess, maybe better than nothing, but it's not what people want to do. So you can't have any suggestion. This is the public reveal of the Martin Snyder methodology. I mean, all these things need names, right? So we've affectionately called this the highway. People usually chuckle then, but it's all right. So it comes from, it's either my way or, right? So that's the waterfall influence, and there is an alternative, right? And it looks good. I mean, we can build a parallel methodology, right? And it isn't just us as software practitioners. Other groups can build a parallel methodology as well. And so what we've done is in the waterfall methodology, up here we have the design and implementation. That was where some combination of our software assets were working, but they were working, they were still handing things off even between them. I've extended things, and I've extended things backwards, back to the beginning. I start at the beginning of time. Okay, I start, well, in most waterfall methodologies, there's one or two, but for the limited one we've put on the boards, we start at the beginning of time. So I'm coding. I'm coding right, at the 0 hour of requirements development. And I can do that, right? Because I know enough requirements to start doing something. And there's development tasks which don't correlate with requirements anyway. Like if someone says, look, we're building this application, and what it's going to look like is you're going to have like this workforce in the field, and they're going to have they're going to be holding iPads, right? That's what we envision. They're going to have some like Bluetooth thing that's scanning barcodes maybe. Like if that's the way this thing is going, then hey, well you gotta start figuring out what are my practices going to be with respect to iPad development or as a web app or whatever it is. And you got to start, like, how am I going to lay out my code, and what libraries am I going to use, and things like that. There's no reason that you can't start early, and what typically happens is this time gets built into a later waterfall anyway and confuses things, right? It's like, gee, we've been working for a month and we've made no progress against the requirements. Why is that? And well, the why is that is because there's potentially a lot of work that has to happen that doesn't directly correlate with the requirements. And now we're in the design phase. I'm still coding, right? And it's like, we're trying to answer questions about like, how are we going to do like a modal dialogue, or how are we going to represent this piece of information? And you can write that in a Word document, but sometimes it's faster and easier to write it in code and just have a screenshot of what you're doing or something. So you're still just coding. And then we get to these implementation phases. Well, and I think that's pretty clear. And then I'm still coding all the way through to the end of testing, and then this happens as well, right? And what's really going on is, I'm not changing anything. I think people get a sense that these are some activities that are going on right now. And what changes is the sizes and the durations and the amount of work that you do here. But what really changes is who has the ball. Right? That's what I always talk about at Wingspan and on these projects, is who's really in charge of the direction of your development efforts. And so I have these two blocks here where your software practitioners are in charge. They're making all the key decisions. They're getting to do things that are important to them. So if we're talking about solving technical debt, well, this is the part of the project where you get to solve technical debt. Again, we're talking about doing activities that are concurrent with waterfall activities. And then here, well, the requirements are done. So now we actually have formal requirements. And so what we want to work on in this prototype phase is we want to work on things which test the requirements, right? Because there's always a negotiation. There's residual activities. There's remediation of the requirements themselves. New requirements need to be added, or things need to be changed to reflect design decisions or something like that. So you want to focus on activities which are going to contribute to that process. Because what you would like at the end of the design phase is more formal requirements. But a lot of time, those requirements are unchanged. The requirements don't typically change until you start even getting all the way into testing, right? Where that's where you start to have these more complicated negotiations of, oh, no, I meant this, or I read it and thought this, and you don't really know who is right. And then engineering loses the ball. And during the implementation phase, the analysts have the ball, right? During the implementation phase, you do not want engineers doing anything that doesn't directly correlate with requirements. And if you thought about it, if you thought it back to Waterfall, my goodness, if you could do that here, right, how great would that be? I mean, this is one of the reasons the estimates are off by so much, is because everyone's like, oh, well, we have 200 requirements this time, we had 200 requirements last time, we should be able to estimate how long it'll take. And the problem is you spend a month working on not requirements, right? But you see, you try to front as much of that work as possible, and you try to clarify as many of the requirements. And so when you come out of here, when you start the implementation, one of your outputs is you have what you hope to be a more accurate estimate, right? This improves the waterfall methodology. You come out not only having a bunch of stuff, but you also have, a clearer direction of exactly what your activities are going to be. And that's a big part of why estimates are off, is not because people don't know exactly how long it's going to take, but because they misestimate the actual activities that they will be doing. And then, of course, we get into the testing phase, and now the only people that the engineering team is listening to are the QA. So I do not work on something that doesn't have a QA created ticket associated with it. The same for UAT. You only listen to the UAT users. And so, it's a parallel methodology. These hands-offs, they change not necessarily your team structure. There's not a handoff in the highway. What you're changing is you're changing your attitude. Okay? And again, we don't control, these are not all the same duration. We don't control how long these are. If I can work 1 or 2 sprints in here, that's good, right? We're talking about selling, people to be part of this effort. Like, this is your chance to settle technical debt, without, getting killed and forced into a death march at the end. But then what's going to change is we're going to change the sorts of things we're working on. We're no longer working on infrastructure and layout now, and even if we're not done, by the way, now we're going to shift our focus, and we're going to focus on things which help to clarify both the design and the requirements. And then we're going to focus on meeting our obligations, and then we're going to focus on refinement and bringing the thing together. So if you were to implement something like this, you got to focus on, at a minimum, these 3 things. The first is vocabulary. You don't want to say something like, hey, we're going to start software development at the same moment you're starting on the requirements. I would recommend never saying that to anyone, not even at a conference. Thank goodness there's no video. But you can find compatible terms, right? I'm doing exploratory activities. I am project bootstrap activities. I'm doing prototype. I'm piloting this. I'm trying to clarify, right? I'm doing supporting activities for these waterfall things. You want to, and I think that the easiest way to wordsmith stuff and to try to spin it is to be accurate, right? Is to say those things and actually mean it, right? To say, look, this is what we're doing, right? We are trying to support these waterfall activities. We're just trying to support them in an efficient way, which will teach all of us more about everything that we need to know and put us in a better position. You might want to add process, which I know is not what everyone would expect to hear. But you might run into afoul of certain things. Like you might, let's just say we have an SOP that says, you can't have any code prior to this inception date, and we're going to audit for that, right? And so it's like, well, gee, now I'm out of luck. Now all this work I've done, I have to throw away, or I'm going to get blocked. But what you can always have, almost any hard and fast rule like that always has some remediation element to it. And so what I suggest is having reconciliation steps. So it might be useful, for instance, at the start of the implementation phase, is you might have a formal activity to bring all that stuff under the umbrella, to have some formal code review or this or that, or whatever makes sense in the organization. You want to do these things on your own. Right? We've already established that. You're not going to get full support to do them. So you want to do them on your own. And you don't want to tell everyone. You don't want to keep a secret either, right? And so you have to kind of walk this fine line. Again, we talked about with the cross-functional team, trust being a big thing, is you want people that want this to succeed and want to be a part of it. And then there's the planning stuff. Is that, despite, with all of this stuff, there are still waterfall activities. Like I didn't talk, for instance, about delivering a design spec, right in the middle of my methodology. But, if you're obligated to do that, you have to do that. And it's not enough to be like, no, we don't want to do that because look at all this progress we're making, right? You have to be a well-mannered participant in the larger process. So let's shift for a second. We'll talk about delivering emerging technologies. And I wrote down a few categories of emerging technologies that are commonly talked about. We'll take a look at a few of those. So tools, like I think the development tools are something that are probably the easiest to use. Languages, libraries, frameworks. I think that's one of the things that there's a lot of great talks here on those things. We want to be able to take advantage of those. instead of databases, I put storage and query engines. I'm trying to build this umbrella that takes into account like all the NoSQLs and the specialized like data stores and key value stores and something like Solr, which is you can use it like a database, but it really isn't exactly a database. And then this whole analytics field. I mean, the analytics stuff is probably the biggest growth area in technology this calendar year. And now we get back to the original hostility. You got to look at what really goes on when you deploy on-premise software. And what people a lot is, like, let's just say I'm on this project and we use WebLogic, and I don't like WebLogic because the developer laptop I've been given doesn't really have a ton of RAM, and when I run WebLogic it takes too long to start up. And look, I can dump that and I can just unzip Jetty, right? And I can run Jetty and I can cycle much faster, and it's better anyway. This whole thing should just use Jetty, right? It's that simple. Just look at what I just did. But there's such a huge difference between a developer unzipping something and using it on their machine and some operational organization taking responsibility for something. There's a couple categories that a lot of people, it's like they forget about when they're doing these things, and then when someone else brings it up, it's like, oh yeah, right? And it can really blow things up. A high availability, you got to have some clustering solution. You got to have some answer for things going down, or potentially the ability to do like a rolling upgrade where you can upgrade software with zero downtime. Monitoring is, that's like probably the most important part of DevOps, right? It's like I think that really any idiot can tell when the system is down. Right? Doesn't require a high level of skill to be able to, but to say something like, you know what, the system is like 3% slower than it was last week, and I've been checking, and it's actually linearly climbing up in a way that's too slow to detect, but it's actually 20% slower than it was 6 months ago. Like, being able to say something like that, I mean, that's where people make their money in operations, is that they see something coming before it becomes a problem, and they solve it also before it becomes a problem. And monitoring is really the cornerstone of that. And then you get into like backup and restore stuff, and that makes a big difference when you're talking, especially about these like storage engines and stuff. And I mean, I've seen some things in my personal experience where systems you can back them up easily enough, but a restore takes days or weeks, and crazy obligations of things that happen when you do a restore, and it's kind of unimaginable consequences. But it's not something that a lot of people spend a lot of time thinking about when they're doing technology selection of what would it really mean to try to restore this thing from a backup with a data set that doesn't fit on a Blu-ray or something like that. And so one thing that you can see is that cloud vendors have exactly the same problems that our hostile environments have, right? They're just more specialized. They're saying, look, it's expensive to run this infrastructure of this software, and I just want to amortize those costs across a high number of clients, and each one will benefit, right? So when they're looking at adopting, this technology, that rather than have to build up, their $500,000 Postgres infrastructure, in my example, they can pay $3,000 a month and use it here and get started. And it's the exact same thing, right? And so you want to look and you want to say, oh, well, can I use a cloud vendor, right? Can I maybe save people some time and lower the cost of adoption, right? And this gets complicated, right? Because your application might have an SLA and the cloud vendor may not have something similar, right? Or the converse is that your application might be a pilot, which might have like almost no requirements, but your operations group doesn't really support anything without a super expensive SLA, right? And it's like, look, this thing is like, it's a 10-user pilot, it's business hours in one time zone, right? If we could just use this, and, if we can always bring it in-house later, right? And that's something to look at and think about. It's like, okay, well, if you bring it in-house later, a lot more will be known, right? Remember how I said cost certainty is such an important element, right? The technology will be aged. You'll know the value. The value will be more clear. You have time for the market to develop. You'll have a better sense of what the job force is like. You might be able to work out a deal with the cloud vendors. Like, look, fine, we're against the cloud. We're not going to let our data be in the cloud. But for us as an organization, it makes sense for us to run our own infrastructure and have our cloud vendor manage that for us. Maybe they would be interested in an arrangement like that, or consulting services or something like that. It gives you time to look at things, especially in a period of low commitment. Other things you got to look at, these other phases I didn't have on my waterfall diagram, like the maintenance phase, or like training of new team members, or training of maintenance programmers, or training of operational staff. And so if you're going to present an emerging technology, you start with that stuff, right? You say, look, we're recommending this technology, and look at all this documentation that's available. Look at this is how we would approach, training people on this, even people that didn't have access to the original core team members, or things like that. Another fun one, you got to pay attention to compliance in some circumstances. Like you might be in a situation where every write to a database has to be audited, right? And the technology you've chosen might not actually support that. So you might have to build that level of auditing into the application or something of that nature. So it's one of these things that a lot of times it gets forgotten, and then when it comes up, it blows the whole thing up, and then there's a disincentive to ever try something like that in the future. So I came up with a few examples of what I call the positive examples of adopting emerging technologies. These aren't all emerging right now, but in hostile environments. And the first one I always like to talk about is Git subversion. So I don't know if anyone here has ever here used Git who has access to such a thing. I mean, do people still use subversion today? A couple? This was like 7 years ago. This was awesome, right? So what Git subversion does is it's the Git front end, and it can work against the subversion back end. And no one has to know. It just works, okay? So I have my team, I have my 5 developers. They are doing branching, they're doing the feature branches, and they have a branch maintainer, and he's merging the stuff in, and they can send stuff either through the central server, or they can do like the side passing of change sets to each other. They can do everything Git can do. And then when they push the central repository, it goes to subversion. And if you have a subversion user who's doing pulls off the thing, they'll get all the right stuff. It might look a little different than they would expect, but it's not going to, the result's not going to look any different. This is like the A+ of using emerging technologies in hostile environments. The team benefits, there's no long-term obligation. Other programmers don't have to use the tool. It doesn't change any of the build processes. There's no operational headaches. There's zero impact on anyone else. And if you can find something like that, then certainly you go ahead and you use it, especially if it's going to help bring you in the direction that you want to go. And I think when you look at next steps beyond this, which I think the hope of everyone in doing some of these things is that you could be so successful, you're the hero of the organization, and people want more. They want to replicate your success. They want to change the culture you actually want. You can imagine, and when your head's on the pillow, that 5 years from now, it's like, oh, well, now everything that we're doing is agile, and it was because of these guys that didn't give up in the face of the hostile environment. The play framework is a cool one, right? So it's all Scala all the time. It's built on Akka, it's actors, but you can use the play framework and you can build a WAR file. And I think that the play engineers, they're happy when you do that. I think part of them dies inside every time play is deployed as a WAR file. But you can deploy it as a WAR file and throw it into a traditional J2EE environment. You can write a play application in Java, right? Java, whatever version you're locked into. And you can do all those things. And again, the operational impact is pretty much nil. They're getting a WAR file, and they know what a WAR file is. They don't really have to change any practices, right? This is going to change a little bit as a new framework, right? So you're going to want to. There's going to be some impact, but it's not. You're not writing. You're not writing Akka actors, right? You're not doing stuff that's super complicated that requires new thought. That's something like that. And you see a lot of these frameworks, a lot of these libraries. The impact can be very, very low on the ancillary things. This is a step up, though, because it's going to impact other developers. It's going to impact future developers. And certainly you can see the difference of doing play in kind of the prototypical fashion and writing it in Scala and stuff. Still might be something that you can pull off, or you could even deploy that as a WAR file. But you can see how you're going to raise the bar on yourself. And you can do that. Right? You just have to understand what the obligations are. As we're making this technology selection, we need to have an answer for how this is going to be maintained in the future. So React.js, this is something Wingspan uses a lot of, and we really, really like it. It's a little different than Play, though. You're still writing JavaScript. It's a different style. There's an education in using the framework. But React.js introduces new tooling, right? It changes the build process in a way that a lot of people aren't familiar with, and it creates JavaScript files with this JSX stuff encoded, which a lot of editors can't handle, and people can't always use the tools they're familiar with. Now, it depends on what the tools they're using are for whether or not that's a problem. But again, we can see how we're ratcheting it up. It's like we can get a lot of benefit out of this, but we have to have the answers for those questions. So now we look at cloud solutions and Solar in the cloud. Now we're back to A-A. This is a really good one. And the number one thing about Solar is it's almost never an actual data store. There's never data stored in there you can't afford to lose. So you don't have to back up and restore it potentially, right? Solr is a search index. It can give you advanced search functionality in your application. And if you code it correctly, your application doesn't have to go down if Solr is not there. You say this feature is not available at this time, or you can fall back to a database search that might perform slower, or you can do something like that. So you can make a choice, and then you can use this technology in a way that really lowers the burden on these other groups. And then that's a no-brainer. And if it works really great, and people are like, well, now we're concerned about running this in the cloud, you can either make a stronger commitment to the cloud, right, to alleviate those concerns, or you can bring it in-house, and you can say, no, now we want other groups to use this, right? And we have 3 other applications lined up to do it in the next 2 quarters, and we have 5 that will be online in the next 12 months. And so, we're only going to charge your project a 1/8 share, even out of the gate, even though you'll be the only users of it, right? So you can see how, the limited approach may be the best you can do today, but if you knock it out of the park, right, it does give you then next year we can talk about, how you can deliver the next step when you've got your foot in the door. And then so one which is much trickier is Spark, right? Spark either in the cloud or not in the cloud. I mean, this is it's this huge real-time analytics engine, and a lot of these big organizations, they aren't ready to get their head around that. And there's almost no chance you'll be able to share those costs because the problems that it solves are very specialized. Not a lot of applications have them. But if you do have them, wow, right, this is great. But you're still okay because, it's not like a data set you're going to store. Like usually it's doing like real-time data analytics. But you're going to have to answer a lot of questions if you use something like that. Your best answer is always to come to the first meeting with all the answers to those questions. Is to understand everything that I've said and with what the attacks are going to be, the rational attacks, the concerns about what you're saying, and to have answers for as many of those things as like, oh, well, here's a cloud vendor that can provide the service for this cost over this time period, and here's their monitoring capabilities, and so on and so forth. So I do have a final words of advice. I'd like to draw careful attention to the following 2 key words. Anytime you are talking about any of this stuff, never use either word. Just don't, ever, okay? Agile is a hostile word to these hostile environments. It is. And if you use that word, they're not going to like you, and they're going to want you to fail. So if you're in one of these environments, focus on it. And if you look at my slides, you'll see I only used Agile twice, and once is here, and the other is on the title on the first slide. And I kind of had to do that to get everyone in the room in the first place. But when I was talking about things, you can see I was very careful in the language. I'm talking about building a faster feedback loop and going straight to the things that you want to do, the cross-functional team. You focus on those things. You don't focus on Agile practices because it's going to make it harder. You're going to add hostility that may not even be there. Quality is a fun one because you can have 2 people. They could spend 10 or 20 minutes talking about quality and then they walk away and neither one has any idea what the other person said. Right? They heard all the words, but there's different notions, right? I mean, there's software quality, there's quality of process. People that work in regulated environments know, like if your quality department has nothing to do with software. Like it's all like making sure all the papers are signed and you have, all the process followed. When you talk about like Agile practitioners, when they talk about quality, they're talking about value delivery. Right? It's like when you're trying to lower your defect count and make your date by dropping features off, right? And you say that to an Agile person, it's like you're not improving quality, right? You're throwing quality overboard, right? You're completely killing this thing, and the fact that you get your defect count to 0, no one's going to want to use this, right? It's like just don't use it. Find another way to say what it is that you want to say, and you'll be a lot happier. So that's all I have prepared for today. My Twitter handle and blog is up there. Again, this is something that Wingspan's been doing for 20 years, and I have time for your questions now.
Hey, so we talked about this a little bit before your talk started. I work in IT in a much larger organization with a number of competing priorities. We're a little unique with this group because we don't work to make a profit. We're a nonprofit. Right. We have a number of ideals in terms of accessibility and outreach and things like that. But what I'm finding is that the things that make me really excited about technology don't necessarily translate to the people in the boardroom, the people in the meetings with me. And my question is, how do you talk about technology when some people in the room might even say that they hate technology and it's inconvenient and it's complex and it's confusing and they're not excited about it?
Well, thank you for the question. What I would say is that just because they aren't trying to make a profit doesn't really change much. Like, if you are trying to make a profit, it makes it easy to measure like how much revenue is coming in. But in a lot of organizations, it's hard to actually realize how much you spent from a technology perspective to get those. Like, you know how much the company's spending, but not how much you spent directly. One thing that I would look at is to put it in language that they can understand. So for instance, if you have an externally facing website, talking about the number of visitors that you have, or if you put analytics on there and you start tracking conversion rates or people dropping off the homepage without clicking through or something, and then you can show that you're improving those things. That's something they understand. It's like, look, in the last, we made these changes and the visitors to our website are now staying on the website about 7.5 minutes when before they would check the hours and close the window. And maybe that's interesting to them. And if not, ask them, well, what could I say that would make you care? Right? Like, what is it? Like, what is it that you are interested in? Like, is it like, do we want more memberships? Do we want, do we want to fill people? Like, do we want more people during these hours? Like, what is it? How would we measure success? And then what can I do as a technology provider to help contribute to that? And I think it's kind of like a business process type thing, but it's always easier to ask people what they want. And then you just kind of have to vet them both for the honesty of their answer and how much pull they have. Because if it's a board member, then I think you're in good shape. Because they'll look bad if they say, we want this, and then you give them that, and they say, well, we don't care. I mean, that's very challenging at the board level for somebody to absorb something like that. So I think, but that's exactly what I would look at as not revenue, but something that's more valuable to that audience than revenue. Anyone else?
So I've seen Agile projects work really well for like incremental delivery or additional features on an existing product, but we're struggling right now is on a very large project. And how do you do a large project where you need to do a lot of upfront requirement gathering and cost analysis and that kind of stuff? Also, there's 9 concurrent work streams going on in different groups working across all different areas. And how do you manage dependencies across these work streams without making it feel like big design and sort of that kind of stuff? I feel like nobody can do big projects well. I've read a lot about this, but I don't know, just your thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, it's tricky because my message is, look, you're screwed, but this is the best you can do to get started. And you've heard that before for that circumstance. But what I'm advocating in this case may not be helpful in your circumstance because you're on a team of teams. And it doesn't necessarily help for one team. Like, let's just say you did all this stuff or something better. And you were twice as efficient. You got much more done in less time. How does that benefit the overall program? I would argue not at all, right? Because everyone's going to wait for the last finisher. Like, it doesn't do you much good to get first unless you're then going to break your team up and contribute to other teams. It's a very kind of a long play. I would wonder how the 9 sub-teams are communicating. I mean, a lot of what Agile is about is the feedback loop and communication. And if the 9 teams are not communicating, that might be the first place to start because their success is going to be measured by the other 8 parties.
We have all tools, Jira, Slack, whatever. It's like.
Well,
you get different standards.
I guess what I think more about is like investment and caring. Like the mechanics of communication, I don't think are particularly important. You can always improve the mechanics, or you can always have great mechanics, and it's like Jerry Maguire, right? It's like hey, you think we're fighting, but I think we're finally talking. It's that's a challenging problem. I can think about it some, but I don't think that this presentation is a particular utility to you, unfortunately. There was one other question in the back, I think.
So my question or comment kind of follows on to the previous question. Working for a defense contractor, we have the same, it sounds like the same limitations that you have dealing with, you have a set schedule and a set budget, but the contract says you shall do Agile, whatever that means. So we have a hard time getting started where you have an 18-month program and you spend a couple of months just figuring out what the system's supposed to do. Meanwhile, meeting the end date, and we want everything and, bug free and all that stuff. And it just seems like for the last 4 years, we struggle and can't figure out how to get going and succeed.
Well, I mean, the longer the project, especially when it's in Waterfall, like Waterfall, the whole methodology is based on this knowledge of, perfect knowledge leads to accurate estimates. And so since I've fulfilled the requirements 100% with no ambiguities, now the engineering staff knows exactly how long. It's like all these false premises. So if I was on like an 18-month Waterfall project, the first thing I would do is I would probably put the 18-month target completely out of my mind. It's like, either we're going to hit that or we're not going to hit that. But it's not going to be because we're trying to hit it, right? It's going to be because it is what it is. I mean, this thing's going to take a certain amount of time. When we get within reach, when we get to, say month 13 or 14 of the project, that's when people are going to decide what's more important, the date or the feature set. And that's how, like, that negotiation always happens right when you get into that stretch run. What I would focus on more, and I think what's like the heart of Agile practices, this is especially early on when the least amount is known. The feedback loop is the most important. Right? The continuous integration server is the most important. It's like, look, and then you focus on the things which you feel will solicit the greatest amount of feedback. And when you take away Agile as a methodology and you talk about it as a word, what it is agility as an organization, the ability to think and move quickly. This leads to speed, okay? But there's a clarity of thought that leads to agility, right? When everything is clear in your mind and you understand exactly what you're doing and you understand the hidden nuances, then you can move at a very high rate. And this is what everyone wants. And so that's what I would seek to attain, is the clarity of thought. And everything I did early on, I wouldn't even be looking at timelines or deliveries. I would be trying to clarify. I would try to frame out as much as we can. And I mean, there's a lot of vocabulary that can do this and people that are, so I'm talking about being Agile versus the specific methodologies. If you look at the specific methodologies, they'll talk about, like crafting user stories, and especially one that would meander through parts of the application. But it might be like we want to stay away from the workflow engine because that's going to take a while to get up and running correctly. But we could either fake it or we can go down this other path, and that'll give us just as many answers. And the other thing I think, which is a big part of all of this, is you want to socialize the responsibility, right? I mean, there's like Waterfall has this implication that each subsequent step is the boss of the previous step, right? It's like, I don't like what I'm seeing, therefore you did a crappy job, right? It's like, I'm in UAT and it's not what I expected, so everyone's terrible at their jobs. And it's not true, right? It's like, it's just kind of a byproduct of the thing. But if you can socialize their involvement earlier, then they're not able to do that. And again, what I'm talking about is trying to reduce the hostility. And the number one way you reduce the hostility is you bring people from those later stages in earlier. You share with them, you make them involved, you make them care, right? We talked about some of that. And trust is a big part of this, right? I mean, if you bring your enemy into your camp, right, and they're predisposed to try to make you look bad and get you fired, then that's probably going to be a mistake. And they're going to share a screenshot with some other team or someone who's look, these guys are way behind schedule and this is the best screen they have, and they it's like you're going to get cut off at the knees. So you want people that you can trust who are going to value their involvement in the process. But to speak directly to it is I would just ignore that schedule and just go at it and try to collect as much information as you can. And then when you start to get that information, then you can decide what to do with it. Was hey, we'll be close enough to 18 months that everything will be okay, or we got to have a serious talk, but at least now, we have a lot of ammunition. We can say, here, this functionality, we've mapped it out, and that's going to take us to 16 and a half months, and we think that would be a good stopping point for delivery, and break everything off into a second phase. And that's going to be better, because if you wait too long, if you extend this thing to 2.5 years, the odds of anyone caring when it meets the light of day are so slim, that would be a big mistake. Is there anyone else? Well, it's lunchtime. I'm happy to stay up here to answer any questions privately. So.